folks. Welcome to this fourth lecture in this 8-part series of lectures on New Testament Christology. We have finally come, thank God, to the figure of Jesus himself in his first century Jewish context, and the way in which Jesus, his person and work, and his own understanding of his person and work are contextualized within, as we've studied in our second and third lectures, the context of exclusivist Jewish monotheism, with its angelic and messianic speculations and praxis, and within the wider world of Greco-Roman paganism and polytheism. Who did Jesus think he was? What did Jesus think he was doing in relation to the one God of Israel, Yahweh, and in relation to humanity? Jesus was, after all, clearly, as were most of his contemporaries, a rigorous Jewish monotheist. He believed in one creator and covenant God, the God Yahweh, the God of Israel, over against the plethora of gods in Greco-Roman paganism and polytheism. But how can we get a sense of what Jesus himself might have thought about his own person and work vis-a-vis the one God of Israel, Yahweh, and vis-a-vis humanity? What kind of evidence do we have? Well, we have the 27 letters, or 27 books of the New Testament, of course. But we don't know quite when to date all of them and how exactly to use all of them. That is tricky business. The only texts in the New Testament that we can date with some relative confidence are the letters of Paul, which most scholars deem to be authentically Pauline. There are 13 letters in the New Testament attributed to Paul. There are disputes about a few of those letters, some scholars thinking they perhaps come from Pauline associates, that is, the pastorals, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and there's some dispute as well about 2nd Thessalonians, about Colossians and Ephesians. But nevertheless, the other 7 letters are almost indisputably Pauline. I think also Colossians is certainly Pauline, and there's a good case to be made for several other of the letters. But nevertheless, they're all in the Pauline tradition, and several of the letters we can date very early in the late 40s through the 50s, making Paul's letters, the authentic ones, doubtless some of our earliest textual evidence in early Christianity. And it's not that those letters say loads of things directly about Jesus and what he thought about himself. They actually don't. But, and this is the key, the early letters of Paul reflect an easygoing assumption and agreement about Christology. That is, Paul simply assumes again and again that his churches, many of which are composed at least partly of some rigorous Jewish monotheists, and many of his early Christian apostle associates, Peter, James, and John in Jerusalem, for example, simply agree that Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified, resurrected, glorified, enthroned Jesus of Nazareth, is somehow to be regarded as intrinsic to the one God of Israel, Yahweh, distinguishable from Yahweh in some mysterious sense as Son from Father, but nevertheless divine himself. And not in a way which suggests that Paul and the early Christians believed in 2 or 3 gods, but somehow believed in one God that was one God within whose own inner and dynamic life one could make personal distinctions between the Father and Christ the Son. And Paul simply takes that theological conceptuality and the attendant devotion to that one God, Christologically reshaped, pneumatologically reshaped, that is by the Spirit, takes it for granted. It's not something for which he has to argue in his letters to other Christians. Even in his letters to churches he did not found. Let's take the letter to the Romans. He doesn't have to argue for the divine Christology, which he clearly articulates in the letter to the Romans, as with his other letters. And he doesn't have to argue with other apostles or the influence of other apostles like Peter, James, and John in the articulation of divine Christology. It seems to have been a place of common ground in early Christianity, at least in the early Christianity reflected by Paul and by the Jerusalem apostles with whom he is at times in engagement and sometimes in disagreement in his letters. So it's important, if Paul and the early Jewish apostles in Jerusalem agree that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. How did they come to that view? Especially if that view is attested as early as, let's say, the letter to the Galatians, sometime in the late 40s. That's less than 20 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. How did these Jewish monotheists come to the view that a recently executed human being, a Jewish monotheist himself no less, was to be regarded as and was to be worshipped as intrinsic to and expressive of the one divine creator of the universe? Fascinating stuff. Um, the other evidence we have, of course, are the other texts outside of the Gospels, Acts, and the other texts of the New Testament, many of which are very difficult to date. Jude and James perhaps are early, but perhaps not. The Gospel of John, First and Second and Third John, Revelation might be in the late 60s, but quite possibly as late as the 90s. So we're trying to get a sense of when do we date these texts and how do we use this evidence. Of course, the direct, if you like, evidence we have on Jesus's own life, and then through that evidence, his thinking about himself and his person and his work in relation to God and in relation to humanity, is the four Gospels in our New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But that itself is not straightforward evidence. When were these texts written? How do they relate to the actual events? Were these eyewitnesses, or did they get their narratival information about Jesus from somewhere else? And if so, where did they get it? And if so, how reliable was it? And so on, and so on, and so on. This is, I think, how this works. It looks as though, according to most scholars, and myself among them, that Mark is the earliest gospel, probably being dated sometime in the 60s, late 60s, could be as late as the early 70s, probably not much later than that, but nevertheless, a good deal of time, let's say almost 20 years after Paul's letter to the Galatians. Roughly 20 years since Paul's letter to the Galatians, so a bit later. Now, of course, Mark contains narratival information, which no doubt takes us back before Paul's letter to the Galatians. We just have to be careful about texts that are written later and making sense of, okay, how does that affect the narrative portrayal of Jesus? Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source probably, and are probably to be dated to the 70s and or 80s. Difficult to know. I think that Matthew and Luke contain lots of material that goes back as early as Mark's material, that gives us particularly in the case of Matthew and Luke, lots of teachings of Jesus, lots of oral tradition about Jesus, but the texts themselves probably post-date Mark. The Gospel of John is probably the last gospel of all, potentially being written somewhere in the 90s, aware of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but adding all kinds of unique material and insight. So how do the four Gospels work? I think the best case is made in this way. I think that Mark was himself not an eyewitness. This is early Christian tradition, which we find in various places in the first couple of centuries. But the evidence that we have from an early figure in Christianity called Papias from the late 1st and early 2nd century is the figure of Papias tells us that Mark is a disciple probably of the Apostle Peter, who is living and preaching in Rome, and before his crucifixion upside down, according to Christian tradition, by the Emperor Nero in the 60s. Before that, Peter is living and preaching in Rome. Mark is a disciple of Peter, and Mark records a gospel about Jesus' life, about who he was and what he did, by recording what Peter said to him. So Mark is writing out in rich, creative, artistically pleasing narratival form the gospel, as it were, the life and teachings of Jesus, as reported by Peter. Matthew, I think, could be an early disciple of Jesus, so possibly an eyewitness, but also possibly not. But that's not crucial for what I'm about to say here. Matthew incorporates into his gospel most of Mark's gospel, minus a few episodes with some minor adaptations, but adds loads of teaching material about Jesus, which he got from either being an eyewitness or, I think, probably more likely from some other source, some other early tradition. Think of the Sermon on the Mount, by and large, Matthew 5 to 7. This is special Matthew material that is largely, except for a few points, not in Mark. Luke incorporates loads of Mark's material. Luke admits at the beginning of his gospel that he himself was not an eyewitness, was an associate of Paul, who himself did not know the historical Jesus. But Luke himself is not an eyewitness, but he goes and speaks to eyewitnesses, apostles, disciples, etc., and learns from them, he says, the relevant events, and tries to write a nice, orderly narrative. So he says in his preface, he uses lots of Mark's gospel, but rearranges it so that the presentation is more pleasing to him, uses some of Matthew's gospel, incorporating lots of Jesus's teaching, and then has some special Lucan material of his own. John, I think, is the best case, along with Mark's use of Peter, for an eyewitness. I think John, now there's a debate about the authorship of John, which John was it, who's the beloved disciple, etc., etc. Let's not get bogged down. But I just suffice it to say that I think a good case can be made that John is an early eyewitness, that John was there for lots of the events, and that partly accounts for the character of John over against Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke read like ancient historical narratives of somebody that it seems to me were not actually up close eyewitness present during some of the events and teachings. John reads less like that, more like someone that is up close and personal and having these conversations as a participant in them, as an eyewitness. But this is the nature of our material. Scholars debate how reliable the Gospels are. I think we have good reason to believe that, by and large, the Gospels give us very reliable information about who Jesus thought he was and what Jesus thought he was doing. So we've now gone 12 minutes. Let me say a few things in the next 5 or so minutes about key moments in the Gospels which give us a sense of who Jesus might have thought he was. Now, a preface to that. This is very tricky because it's not just that you have to find an episode of Jesus doing or saying something. Like, let's take a famous scene in Mark 2, 1 to 12, where Jesus, so a paralytic man is brought in before Jesus. Jesus heals the man, but also says first, the man's sins are forgiven, rise, walk, etc. And the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, those that are quite serious about preserving the scriptures, the scriptural traditions, their interpretation, their application, whatever, are quite offended by Jesus's claiming to be able to forgive this person's sins, because so they rightly think that ought to be a prerogative of the one God of Israel alone. So Jesus is encroaching upon the sacred territory of exclusivist Jewish monotheism. We'll come to that in a minute, but it's not just that episodes like that where you get kind of Jesus thinking and doing in a gospel that, oh, well, that's a chance where we might learn something about how Jesus thought about himself, his person, and work. There are also other features of the Gospels which it might be hard to detect, but equally well might tell us something about what Jesus thought about himself, his person, and work. I'll take one example. The Gospel of John, I was going to take something from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but let's take the Gospel of John, begins in this magnificent Johannine prologue introduction, which has several things going on. John is alluding to Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. That's Genesis 1. John has, in the beginning was the Word. So John is thinking back at the beginning, back within the exclusivist Jewish doctrine of creation, the pre-existent Jesus as Logos, as Word, as creative potentiality, as creative person, was there, creating the universe. And then, John alluding now to Exodus, where the God of Israel rescues Israel out of Egypt and then tabernacles in their midst in the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. John says, and then the Word, John 1:14, became flesh and tabernacled, eskenosin in Greek, pitched his skene, that is tent or tabernacle, in their midst and dwelt among them. So in John 1, there's this creative use of creation theology and temple theology, thinking of Jesus as the creator, but particularly in John 1:14, thinking of Jesus in his own person as being the embodiment of Israel's God, the location where heaven and earth meet, the location where Israel and the world's praises are to be gathered, the location where healing and forgiveness happen, rather than the Jerusalem temple. But that's John's prologue. So should we say that that can't tell us anything about the mindset of Jesus himself? Well, we don't know. It very well might. And we have to form other hypotheses and ideas to know whether it will or not. But that's just an example. The narratival artistic features of the gospel writers, even when they're not directly talking about Jesus, still might tell us something about what Jesus might have thought about himself, about the Christology of Jesus, as it were. But let's jump through a few features. Mark 2 and in other places, Jesus clearly says that he has the capacity to forgive someone's sins. And when it is said to him that that is a prerogative of the one God alone, Jesus doesn't respond back in those passages and say, well, no, actually, 2 people, 3 people, or 5 people have the capacity to forgive sins. No, Jesus simply accepts the charge that only the one God is supposed to do that, but forgives the sins nonetheless. There's a kind of implicit claim in those stories to being the place where Israel's one God is constituted. You have the transfiguration story where Jesus goes up on top of a mountain, and a couple of the key disciples are there, and then Moses and Elijah appear. And Peter says, let me build a couple of tents for you. And then in an evocation of Exodus, where Moses goes up to get the tablets and his face is shining, the text says that God says in the transfiguration story, this is my son, listen to him. And Jesus' face isn't shining as though the glory were reflecting from the outside. His entire body is shining as though it's being charged from the inside, as though Jesus himself is the tabernacle or tent. Peter doesn't need to throw a few tabernacles and tents up. Jesus himself is the location of the dwelling of God. We could mention the healing stories and various other stories, but let's go ahead and jump to the trial scene where Caiaphas asked Jesus if there are many other passages, and in some ways it's terrible to jump so quickly, but I'm just trying to hit the highlights. Pilate asked Jesus, there's a longer trial, but are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? And then Jesus answers, but he interprets his answer by reference to 2 key scriptural texts which have been important to him probably his whole life. You say that I am, Jesus says, and you will see the Son of Man, he says, coming with the clouds of heaven, that's Daniel 7:13, and seated at the right hand of power, that's Psalm 110. The high priest tears his robes and claims blasphemy, which echoes the blasphemy from the beginning of Mark's gospel where Jesus has tried to forgive sins. So in a sense, the gospel of Mark is framed by these references to blasphemy. And Jesus says, you will see the Son of Man, that is him, coming on the clouds of heaven. That is, Jesus is evoking the scene from Daniel 7, where this mysterious Son of Man figure that has generated all sorts of messianic and divine speculation in Jesus' day. And Jesus is saying, I will be that figure riding on the clouds, which is something only the God of Israel does in the Old Testament. I will be enthroned, which is usually something that only is true of the God of Israel. And I will have dominion over the whole universe, which is something usually only true of the God of Israel. Then he says to the high priest, and I will be seated at the right hand of power, an evocation of Psalm 110:1. The Lord said to my Lord, the psalmist says, sit at my right hand. So Jesus is saying, I will be exalted on the clouds, I will ascend to the heavenly throne and I will sit down. The high priest interprets this as one, being ridiculous for this poor Jewish peasant, but also as a blasphemous encroachment upon the unique uh, territory of the one God of Israel. So, lots more could be said about Jesus and his own view of himself. Of course, one has to explain lots of features in the case of New Testament Christology. Jesus' view of himself was unique. Not lots of Jews, I think, thought about themselves what Jesus thought about himself. But Jesus is a real first century Jew. So Jesus' thoughts about himself need to have been somewhat thinkable thoughts, however creatively deployed, for a first century Jew. Probably one that thought he was the sent Messiah. So that has to be explained. Why Jesus is crucified, and particularly why the trial scene is what it is. Why the cry of blasphemy? Why is that a kind of a framing of, in that case, Mark's gospel? One has to explain all that. One has to explain why quickly thereafter, as I mentioned in the case of Paul's letters, lots of the early Christians seem to agree that, yes, Jesus of Nazareth is divine. How does one explain all that? Is that explicable without Jesus himself having hinted or even stated things which pointed in that direction? It seems to me unlikely. Who did Jesus think he was? Fascinating question to reflect upon. I hope that you've enjoyed this lecture.